Hi, I'm Lucy Duda. I'm a senior concentrating in music, history, and education policy with a focus on interdisciplinary arts for education and social justice. I'm also a Spalter Teaching Fellow at the RISD Museum. I'm here today thanks to the Brown Arts Initiative as part of Hello Precarity, COVID-FML Edition, a speaker series produced by students in Sydney Skybetter's class on curation, ethics, and entrepreneurship in the arts. I'm honored today to be speaking with Nina Simon. Nina is the author of The Participatory Museum and the Art of Relevance, formerly the executive director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, and currently the spacemaker and CEO of Buy for All, a nonprofit that helps civic and cultural institutions work with local communities in their programming and organizing. Sorry, I need to catch my breath. Nina, thank you so much for joining me. To start off, I'd love to know just what's on your mind right now. What's sort of top of mind for you?
I think what's top of mind for me is for those of us who have the privilege to not be in a place that is fundamentally about grappling with basic needs and suffering right now, how can we use the space that we have to radically reimagine our own careers, our organizations, and the work that we might do? And I feel like it's incredibly easy at this moment to always fall into the immediate of where am I today? What's my job going to look like next week? This kind of thing. I think that it's an incredibly powerful time to make space to imagine what do we want to, if this is a transformative moment, what role do we want to play in transformation, as opposed to having the transformation entirely happen to us? Are there ways that we can be agents of transformation at this time?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think like a lot of arts organizations right now are sort of in panic mode, trying to like keep a place in people's minds and grappling with the financial realities, especially of their seasons being canceled. And so there's been this huge push towards like digital programming and staying sort of on people's radar, and the challenge of cutting through the noise online now that everything seems to be happening online. What does it mean, do you think, for cultural institutions to be participatory right now, and keep serving their communities at a time when they can't do that in the way they're used to, right? As you said, like this is sort of a transformative moment. How do you see arts organizations fitting into that?
Yeah, I think that I think the first piece is really getting honest with ourselves about everybody's saying change is happening, change is necessary, we must change. But I think that we have to get honest with ourselves about, do we want to change? Because I think that there are some people, many people probably, who kind of just wish somebody could wave a magic wand and they could go back to the way they were doing it before the crisis. And I think that that's not going to happen. Nobody's going to go back. And for us to not be terrified of what the future looks like, we have to find a way to grieve for what was, and then to commit ourselves with our greatest creative energy to what could be. And so I think that what I see is a lot of organizations that immediately rushed to do things digital because they had this fear of, oh my God, are we going to lose our people? We need to just keep them engaged until we can come back. And I think that that was actually quite exhausting and quite distracting from the potential to have deeper conversations about how is art showing up in people's lives now? What do we think is going to be relevant in the future? And also, who matters most to us? You know, the organization I run now of Buy for All is all about this idea that to become for communities, we really need to be representative of them and co-created by them. And so when I think about participation right now, for me, it starts with the who. Who are the communities that matter most to you right now? Are they actually the communities you had before? Is it somebody who's newly vulnerable right now? Is it a community who you are curious about moving towards? And how can we get really clear about that, getting beyond the abstract definition of community to get really specific, so that we can decide what we might do that might be of the most value now and in the future. And so I think that if we rush to produce, if we stay stuck in an idea of we're just trying to get back to where we were. I think that we're both unlikely to be successful because the world is changing, but also we're unlikely to give ourselves the permission and space to open ourselves to what's truly possible at this moment. You know, especially when you bring up participation, this moment is a moment of great leveling because suddenly the arts organizations don't have their buildings and they're showing up on platforms where the influencers and the leaders on those platforms, some are institutional and have a lot of money behind them, but some are like a teenager, you know, who creates a dance on TikTok, right? And so I think that there's actually a really exciting opportunity around acknowledging that we're working in a different environment where we don't hold that institutional authority in the same way. But again, it requires letting go, unlearning certain assumptions about how we engage with people and learning new ways of and exploring new ways of engaging with them.
Yeah, that's thing I've been thinking about a lot and that I'm really curious about, because, you know, we talk a lot about, and you've talked about work like going beyond this sort of abstract definition of community as like, you know, either just assuming that people in your area will come to you in this sort of nebulous mass, or communities as like those people, right? And, you know, museums and a lot of arts organizations have been so much about like the building and the physical space, and thinking about communities, you know, even if they are doing the work to like dig into who their local communities are, it has been sort of defined by physical proximity, right, in terms of like who's in the area. And I'm really curious what you think that shift looks like how should or could organizations be approaching like figuring out what communities they can serve when they aren't bound by that sort of regional focus, especially because, you know, there's so many organizations like putting out digital content and trying to figure out what to do.
Right.
So how do you sort of, I guess, approach like placemaking or space making,
Yeah.
or
I
do you
actually I see a bifurcation happening right now where I see some organizations actually getting much more interested in their local community. So, and that could be practical, that for example, if you're a museum saying we always got touring shows, objects are not going to tour for a long time, we need to get local, but also it's often very emotional. I'm feeling more connected to my neighborhood, to my city right now, and I want to do more here. So for example, I think about, you know, the Philbrook Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which has been really partnering closely with their United Way to donate to local relief efforts, with artists across Oklahoma to create an online platform for them to sell their work. They're using their garden to turn into a victory garden to grow for their local food bank. And they've really pivoted more locally than they had been before. Similarly, there's a small organization I love called the League of Creative Interventionists. They work with a lot of community placed artists in residence. And I was just talking to their director, Janelle Logan, and she was saying one of the things that one of their residents is doing is a lawn sign exhibition where artists are working with neighborhoods to, if people want them, to give them signs to put out so that everybody literally is the host of the exhibition. So I see some organizations getting hyper local, saying how can we lean into the ways that people care about locality and care about their neighborhoods right now. We're working with a contemporary art center in Panama City, that has started a huge food distribution effort just because their director felt like the people who live in our neighborhood need food, and we've never fully addressed the fact that we are this fancy contemporary art center in a very low income neighborhood, but now, you know, with the crisis, it's colliding. So that's happening. But then, as you're noting, the opposite, or on the other side of the spectrum, I'm seeing some organizations that are saying, you know, we've always, to some extent, had a brand or a story or a presence that was not about our locality, but we've never fully leaned into that. So for example, I was talking to the woman who runs the Dance Theater of Harlem. They're an amazing company. They have obviously a school and studio in New York, but they also have a company that tours around the country. And they have a really deliberate focus on where they tour, so that there are people in Detroit or Macon, Georgia, and other parts of the country who've really over years built up relationships with these predominantly Black and brown dancers. And one of the things we were talking about is Dance Theater of Harlem has a story and an identity that is national and probably international, for people who are African American, who care about social justice, various elements, innovative kinds of ways of making dance. But they've always been really focused on their locality, except for touring. And so we were talking about this question of, is this a time for some organizations that have a very strong brand or a community that's diffuse to actually think more intentionally about how they bring together those distributed folks in a kind of global or national community of affinity and connection through an institutional mission or approach?
So what does that look like, do you think, potentially, like in this digital space?
Yeah, so one thing I often think about is like, okay, if you're, if you're a Sierra Club member, what does that mean? Like, there is no clubhouse you go to. Like, you're somebody who cares about the environment, you're giving some money, and you're kind of connected to this mission that matters to you. Or similarly, if you were in the Girl Scouts, and if you're somebody who's like still, or YMCA, why people are like obsessed, right? There are all these different Y facilities around the country, but people are kind of part of the Y family. And I think that arts institutions, ironically and somewhat to their detriment, have been so focused on differentiation. Here's why our museum is special. Here's our collection, or we're totally unlike any. A lot of them use even, and I've done this in the past, a lot of forward-thinking institutions will even in their branding say, we're not like a museum you've been before, or not your grandma's museum, or whatever that might be. And while that sort of works, it also means that we're training consumers to not think about themselves as museum people in a way, and so there isn't this sense of, oh, I'm part of this collective milieu of people who care about art or people who are curious about science or whatever. And so it kind of creates this competitive scarcity model of that if you like science, you can follow Sue the T-Rex from the Field Museum and you can follow the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Like, they both have amazing Twitter accounts, but there's not a sense of like, oh, I'm a science or aquarium or museum person in that way, And so I think that part of it has to be unlearning our obsession with our own singular brands and kind of that light competition that happens among institutions, and thinking about how do we embrace the idea of what are the organizations that are going to knit together creative people or artistic people or whatever it might be. I was literally just on the phone with the folks who run the Professional Association for all the choruses across America. I'm going to do a keynote for their conference. And we were talking about this phenomenon, which we've all seen on the news, of people singing on their balconies, right? Whether it's in Italy or in New York. And we were talking about this question of, are there people who see that kind of news, get inspired, and decide they want to do it? And is there a role for a chorus as a professional institution that could in some way enable that? And I think this is also, frankly, an example of how, a lot of people have been saying like the crisis is exposing and revealing things that have existed for a long time. There's been data for a long time, right? I wrote the Participatory Museum 10 years ago, it came out, and it, in the foreword talked about this data about how people are participating creatively more than ever, but less than ever with institutions. And so I think that this is a moment, because of this crisis, where we're really being exposed to the way that people are singing on balconies, making posters to say thank you to people, doing all kinds of making their TikTok videos. And I think there's a real question of where do institutions embrace and connect with that participatory culture? I kind of assumed it should have happened 10 years ago. I don't know that it fully did. I'm curious if it'll happen now.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot, especially with regard to the performing arts, because we've seen this sort of increasing bifurcation of these are the professional musicians whose job it is to sit on the stage and play, and everyone else sits in the audience and watches. And I mean, to get all musicology, music history, even from the advent of recorded music, right? You see that start to split, where it used to be if anyone wanted music of any kind, they had to make it themselves, right? And it's been sort of interesting to see that amateur creative movements coming back in those ways.
Well, and I think, again, they've been there for a long time, but now they're being revealed so much more. And it's interesting you actually bring up the advent of recorded music, because Of course, in the theater world as well, it was electricity that moved us to the black box, right? That moved us from, natural light or a lit space where audience and people on stage were lit equally to an unequal. And it would be interesting to ask, that happened a little over 100 years ago, same with recorded music, it would be interesting, I have no idea, but is it possible that we could be going through what might be a major realignment of how these art forms are expressed? I think it's very possible. And to what you're saying, it's also possible if over the next, depending on what happens with a vaccine, if we move quite slowly through the social distancing world, it's possible we may be going to a much more intimate way that art is shared and made together and expressed together. And so I think that the lawn sign exhibition or the small group of people getting together to make art, may become much more dominant. And some of these things may stick and some of them may not. And I think that comes back to this thing of like, just getting out of the hunkering down and waiting for it to be over, and instead saying, what do I want to imagine into the space of what I see coming in the short term, in the long term, or what I might have always secretly dreamed of and might now be possible.
Yeah. I think there are some institutions that are really struggling with this sort of rebalancing of power.
Sure.
Especially, I'm curious, like what you mentioned some like museums that are doing really and great work with like working with communities and embracing a much more like pluralistic approach. I guess I'm curious what the role of institutions going forward might be when they're not bound to place in this way, especially like institutions that did sort of drop the ball on a more community-focused approach back when they should have been doing it, and just sort of what the changing landscape might be.
Yeah, I will say in my own career journey, and certainly I founded Of By For All because I wanted to devote, I would like to say 100%, but maybe it's like 98% of my energy to organizations and individual change makers who are really ready to radically reimagine organizations as community-centered and equitable spaces. So to be honest, part of me is like, I don't really focus on those other folks. Like they've got plenty of, services and consultants and conferences and things like that. I do think though that one of the things I've been really thinking about is this difference between who feels they must change and who wants to change right now. And we've all been shooken up, but I think that people draw different conclusions from that. And kind of as I think about, the position you're in and other students thinking about, the FML of the job market, I think about the fact that, yes, there's probably some grief to have around like you're entering into a job market that's functionally non-existent. But I think that the more interesting place to really be thoughtful is you're entering into a job market that is going to need something different and from you. And so first you have to grieve about the fact that the job you thought you were training yourself to do probably won't exist. But you've already had to reconcile that anyway. But then the next place to go is to say, what is the job I really want? And is there a way that becomes more relevant right now? And I think we have to be really careful not to lie to ourselves about that. But I think that there's a huge opportunity, particularly for people, like you when you were giving your bio, I'm talking to so many more classes and people who are doing arts work with a social justice or community organizing bent. Frankly, there weren't a lot of those jobs before the crisis either. And I think that to some extent, now is a time where job descriptions are going to get rewritten. And again, to the extent that you can have agency in saying, here is the role I want to play, here are the skills that I think I can bring to this moment. I think there's actually quite an exciting opportunity there, and potentially even more of an opportunity than there was this time last year. Because this time last year, you'd be looking for whatever job you could get and then trying to figure out, how do I bring social justice into it? How do I bring community into it? How do I fight for that? And I think that that now there is going to be a divide of which direction organizations go. And for those that decide that they're going to center equity and they're going to center community, they are going to need people with new skills in new roles.
Yeah, I think that's something that I've been actually sort of excited about. I've been running like a Facebook group for musicians to meet and collaborate, sort of like a virtual balcony for everyone. And so I'm really excited about things like that potentially sort of coming to the forefront. I think
right, and think about it, like the other way to think about it is there's no jobs right now, but also everybody has been laid off. So it's like, you know, who's going to compete for those jobs when they come back? Like, you know, the playing field's going to be different. And even to what you just said, I'm thinking like, you know, in 2 weeks, I'm giving a keynote for the League of American Orchestras. How many orchestra managers and trustees and musicians will be in those audiences who have never done the thing that you just said you're doing, who are scared to try it, who can't imagine exactly how they're doing it, and probably will be finding some money to hire somebody to help them think about how to do it for the first time.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, it's been interesting to see, like, with the layoffs that have been happening, and sort of, you know, disheartening to see that often the people who get laid off first, and there have been, you know, massive layoffs at museums, large and small, is like the education departments and the public programming people, and especially like, you know, the departments that tend to have younger and more diverse people working in them, which I think, you know, those institutions are doing themselves a real disservice by sort of like buckling down on like just curation and collections, and what they perceive to be like central to their core mission in the past, which I don't know is necessarily compatible with the way things will be.
It totally sucks, and from my perspective, well, I was about to say it's a dumb strategy, but it's not a dumb strategy. It's just a strategy I wouldn't choose. And it does, again, to that idea that like the crisis uncovers things. It reveals, like, and MoMA's the big example of this, right, in New York, that it reveals that no matter how much they said about like, oh, we're a crossroads or a town square, whatever they say, I don't even know. I don't know that much about MoMA. They clearly have positioned themselves to say, education is not the center of not only is it not the center of what we do, we don't even see ourselves doing it for years to come. And there is, you know, it's interesting though, I would say, to also think about, are there organizations that right now are making the opposite choice? Are there organizations that are saying, you know what, we are going to seriously rethink what it means to manage our collection, or what it means to curate, and who is, you know, able to do that. And I will say that, again, like I like to spend my time with people who are asking those questions and who are getting really creative about the answers. And there are people who are also making those kinds of decisions. They probably don't run the largest, most moneyed organizations, and that's okay.
Yeah, and that decentralization is sort of potentially part of the point.
Right. And I think that, you know, it's interesting that for us, we started up By For All 2 years ago with a real focus on the fact that there is no way, you know, when you go in a restaurant and there's like Seafood Watch or Yelp, people love us on Yelp or whatever it is, like there's no way to walk into a museum or a library or a park or a theater and get a sense of, like, get an immediate read on, you know, am I welcome here? Am I invited not just to look, but to participate? Do they just want my money? Do they just want me as a quota because I'm young, because I'm brown, whatever it might be? And you know, there was some, obviously around the 2016 election, there were more signs that went up of like, you know, all people welcome here kind of signs. But I think one of the reasons we started off By For All is we wanted to create a way for organizations to positively differentiate themselves if they really were committing to being community centered. And we're certainly seeing now that the 50 or so organizations we're working with around the world are all really leaning into this work because they feel like now is the time for them to center equity and community more than ever. They see that being critical to their future and to their sustainability and viability. And some of them, many of them are freaked out. We all spend some time being freaked out right now, but many of them are also excited. They're saying things like, you know, my whole season was canceled. It sucks. It's terrible for us financially, but I can finally get rid of the subscriber model, which was holding us back from being able to really be relevant to our whole community. Or they're saying, you know, blockbusters are totally shut down, but we can finally kill the touring exhibition model, which was not really serving us. So I think that this idea of like, what can we unlearn? And how can we actually use this as a time to vault forward? I think for community-centered organizations, it's actually a great opportunity.
Awesome. Is there anything with of Buy for All that you're working on right now that you're particularly excited about?
I mean, I'm always excited about what the members of the Change Network are doing, but we're also I'm right now working on building some new tools that we're going to be rolling out this summer that are really specific to helping teams kind of make that space for reimagining. So we're building everything from like a very simple 5-minute quiz to get a sense of how might you want to reinvent, what might be some barriers to you doing it, as well as creating a kind of 5-week course or an online experience to help teams really unlearn and re-envision where they want to go and which communities they want to go there with. So that's been kind of new creative work for me, and I feel like it's a contribution I can make to the field right now. So that's feeling really exciting. Yeah.
Yay, that's so exciting. I hope it goes well. As we are nearing the end of our time, I just have a couple more questions for maybe selfish, but I like to think it's also on behalf of all the other seniors out there and just anyone figuring out where to go from here. You started out in a completely different academic and career field than you find yourself in now, studying electrical engineering. So how did you make the switch and get into museums? Was it and like cultural work in general? Was it, I guess, when and how and who did you have to convince?
Almost immediately. So I was always very left brain, right brain. So like studied electrical engineering by day, and then I was a slam poet by night. And while I was in college, and I kept having I kept looking for the right fit for me in electrical engineering. I was a great student, and like every summer I would have an internship or a job that it would just make me cross something off the list that I thought I wanted. And then, you know, that culminated when I was a senior in college with getting kind of my dream job at NASA in DC and being not into it and being bored and having this moment of like, oh shit, I thought I wanted to do this my whole life and that is not correct. And fortunately, you know, I was 21, and I was able to say, okay, what do I want to do? And I actually learned about kind of this idea of museums as places of free choice learning, which was I've always been a very independent learner and thinker. And so I started, I was working 3 days a week at NASA, and I started working and volunteering 3 days a week at this small children's museum running science programming. And my strategy when I first got into museums was I spent about a year working at lots of different kinds of museums, different sizes, different types. And my strategy was always that I would come in as a volunteer or an intern, unpaid, but I would always say, like when I was interviewing or on day one, like, I want to volunteer for 3 months, and then I want us to have a conversation about whether you are going to pay me or not. And so that really created an environment where I think I worked for like 6 museums in my first year. I kept moving on. I worked at multiple at the same time. And like, I was making money as a poet. Like my mom was not thrilled that I had this engineering degree. And I was like, yeah, I'm, you know, selling some chapbooks and like doing some art modeling and like, you know, but I really, some of those internships or unpaid volunteer programs became jobs. And I just had a rule for myself of like, always be learning. And when you're not learning anymore, leave. And I think I had, you know, because I was a very independent learner, I knew I wasn't going to go to graduate school, but I kind of gave myself permission of like, if I cannot make much money, but I'm not spending a bunch of money, you know, on a program, like, cool, that sounds financially better than going to graduate school. So I really looked at it like, how can I learn in all these different places? Museums are different sizes. And it finally led to me deciding, okay, I'm ready to get a full-time job in a museum. and that I decided I didn't care what kind of museum. I cared that it wasn't huge. I decided I didn't want to be in a humongous organization. And I cared really about who I would be working for. And so I found this woman, Anna Slafer, in Washington, D.C. I was living in Washington, D.C. She had done a bunch of really amazing co-created projects with teenagers at the Building Museum and this thing called the Rolling Rainforest. And so I just kind of hunted her down in a nice way. And she was working at the Spy Museum, running exhibitions and programs. We were in DC. I lived with a bunch of activists and techies and lobbyists. And like this one lobbyist guy was like, here's what you do. Like, you call from different phone numbers at different times of the day. Like, you only leave a message once. You get her to commit to an in-person meeting. Like, so I just very aggressively pursued this person who I thought could be a mentor to me. And it took a few months to meet her, but then there was another couple months before there was a job there. It was like a super low level job. She was like, you're an engineer, this doesn't make sense to you. But I just like went all in. And I'm just a big believer that bosses are busy, and they don't want to guess how your skills might help them do what they want to do. So you need to tell them how you can help them. So I remember like when interviewing for the Spy Museum, I sort of had in my mind, okay, this is an admin and programs job. If it's at least 40% programs, then I think I could learn here. And so I asked, what percentage, and they said, oh, we think it's about 50-50. I was like, cool, okay, great. And then I remember they asked for me to bring a portfolio. They wanted like somebody with a museum studies graduate degree. I definitely did not have that. And there are definitely a lot of people in DC who do. And I knew I couldn't bring a portfolio. So instead I made a little lie detector, and like brought in like a paper bag, like you'd bring your lunch to school. And I walked into this second interview and I was like, I know you asked for a portfolio. I don't have that, but I can do this. And I showed them like, hey, we could build, we could teach teenagers how to make their own lie detectors. This could be a really fun workshop, And I just kind of always have intuitively thought about what assets do I have and how do they map to what this other person needs or wants? And so how do I make that crystal clear so they don't have to figure it out themselves? So they don't have to guess, could an engineer actually do this job? Or later, when I was 29 and was applying to become this museum director, as my husband would say, it'd be like, kind of hard for them to hire somebody with a 2 in the front of their age. And so I like very deliberately, they didn't ask for this in the process, but I wrote a 3-year plan because it was clear that they saw me as sort of like a creative maverick. Maybe she could do something interesting, but could she really lead this organization? I had no management experience, no fundraising experience. So I wanted to just kind of like proactively address the question I thought would be in their head. So I didn't say this, but I was thinking in my head, they probably don't think that I could like structure a multi-year plan. Let me show them that I can without them asking me, let me solve that problem for them. So I think that whenever I've done multiple career shifts, and definitely with an entrepreneurial mindset, and I've just always taken the perspective of if I'm going to work for somebody else, I want to show them, make it easy for them to know how I can help. And then frankly, I pretty quickly decided I wanted to work for myself or be the boss, which is a different kind of trajectory.
Cool. So then one last possibly related question. Looking back, what would be your advice to yourself on the precipice of graduating from college? And how would that be different if you were graduating now?
I feel really good about how I approached those first couple years after college and the idea of like, try stuff, give yourself permission to learn. But I will also acknowledge, and I really remember how vulnerable that time was. And actually, I was living in this group house and I painted on my wall at one point this sign that said like, if you get rejected by 100 people, if you can't find a job in the next 6 months, like you're still a good person, like you're still worth something. And because I really I think one of the hardest things about graduating college at any time is there's this fiction that like you've built up your sense of self, your skills, you've made friends, you've been in an environment where you really become, a senior, like you're in control. Yeah, exactly. And then you get like splashed into the big wide world, which doesn't give a shit about you or what you can do. And so again, like, I think the crisis is just exposing the reality of that. So I actually think maybe y'all are better equipped to deal with what I experienced as an incredible sense of depression and uncertainty following graduation. I will say that for me, the thing that helped me through and exacerbated it, and I don't know, I mean, I'm a big feminist, so I don't know if this is the most feminist thing to say, but I met my husband when I was 20. He's 5.5 years older than me, and being around people who were older than me and who kind of had their shit figured out, both made me feel like really like an imposter and like bummed that I was not like them, but also made me see like, oh, when I'm 25 or 26, things will be, you know, like I'm trying to get to a place where I can do some stuff. And so I think that just really being kind to yourself about that transition and what you imagine might be possible, and also how you want to take care of yourself in an environment that, in the best of times, barely gives a shit about 22-year-olds and what they have to offer. And so how are you going to make your way through this? I'll also say on the cultural creative side, I think it is such a huge time and opportunity for entrepreneurial oriented people, because as you were kind of pointing to with some of your questions, like a lot of institutions are not going to be able to pivot. They're not going to be able to really make the fundamental mindset shifts to thrive in this new environment. And so I think there's actually a real opportunity for people who are willing to take those risks and who feel like you have some sense of something that might be good, to go for it. And I think that if nothing else, there will be a lot of people 3 years from now who took the opportunity, and no knock on them, but to go to graduate school during this time. Like, let me just pause. This happened in 2008. A lot of people, graduate school went up because people were like, can't find a job, I'll do this instead and I'll build skills. Well, what happened 2 or 3 years later? There were a lot more people with graduate degrees on the market going for jobs that previously they might have been able to get with a bachelor's degree. And there were people who were maybe in many cases more competitive for them, who had spent those 2 years trying to build a magazine, an art collective, a weird thing, whatever. And I think that I'm highly biased by my own experience, but as an employer, if I'm getting a couple hundred resumes and there are 150 of them that say they spent time in graduate school, and there are 5 that say they created something new, or they tried something that totally flamed out, or they had this wild, skill building story that was very unusual, I'm looking at those more seriously. And I'm curious, because to me, it demonstrates creative thinking and a willingness to be experimental, which is incredibly important to me, at least as I think about who I want to hire.
Thank you so much, Nina. I think that's just about the time we have for today. But thank you again. Thanks also to Sydney Skybetter and the Brown Arts Initiative for making this digital iteration of Hello Precarity possible. Have a great day.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.